Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Caldwell, and I am the APG Women's Network Technical Program Director. And so if you were looking for the Geology of Beer, you've come to the right place, which hopefully you could tell by the advertisement that we have here that says the Geology of Beer. Now, before I bore you, or hopefully not, with some important information and introductions, we wanted to start off with the thing that we know you all came here to do. So even though we are going to talk in more detail later, I'm going to pass it off to Ed to get us started immediately so that we can all start drinking beer. Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you, Rebecca. Cheers, everyone. What I'm going to do briefly here is talk about tasting beer. And when we taste beer, we use all of our senses and yet another one, the sense of pleasure, because drinking beer is pleasurable. These images that I have here are going to help us think about tasting. These are not exact, but they're sort of will illustrate a couple of points I'm hoping to make. So first, the image on the left is meant to get the point across that the olfactory system, how we smell, is intimately entwined with how we perceive flavor, even perceiving flavors in our mouth. Olfaction is about 90% of flavor as we know it. This image on the right is trying to get the point across that we often perceive flavors in different parts of our mouth or in different parts of the tongue. Again, this is not exact, but it's trying to get the point across that you think about tasting and about flavor perception and what it is that we're actually tasting by thinking about it in some ways in different places in your mouth. So the first thing we do when we think about tasting beer is we go ahead, open that beer and try to pour it so you have a decent head. The idea here is to get about 1.5 inches of head. And what that does for us is it will start to take some of the volatiles that are dissolved in solution. They'll come out with the CO2. And if you don't have a good head, swirl it a little bit and try to get some of the head to actually come up and help bring some of those flavors out of it. We then take a few short sniffs. And again, this goes along with the image here on the left. That really starts to bring some of the flavor in. We can talk about some of the flavors later. I just wanted to make sure we got started with sort of thinking about tasting. Unlike wine, we're not going to take a sip. We're not going to spit it out, nothing like that. We're going to actually take more like a schluck. A schluck is like a mouthful, not a big mouthful, but you're going to take a mouthful. The idea is to saturate your tongue and let that beer sit on the center of your tongue, let it roll off the sides of your tongue, completely saturate it. It's the same technique we use when we taste chicken Alfredo or wine. It's absolutely saturate your senses with it. And then later on, think about it and talk about it with friends. That's a main part of it here. So saturate your tongue, let it sit all over your mouth and enjoy. Cheers.
Ed, that was really, really, really hard to hold this in my hand and let you finish telling me how to drink it before I took a sip. It's like holding candy in front of a baby. I kept being like, oh, no, okay. That's delicious, Ed. Thank you so much. Ed will be talking to you about so much more related to how the beer is made, the taste, and the geology. But we're going to start off with some explanations of how the event will go today and introductions. We just wanted to make sure you started drinking. All right, Ed, can I move on? Great. If I can make the slides move, I can move. There we go. Okay, so you should always start with the most important thing, and no event could ever happen without the tons of people who made the event possible. So I wanted to quickly thank everybody who put effort into this event. And to be honest, this slide might not even be complete. And I apologize if you did something for this event and we didn't get your name on here. I do want to quickly have some shout outs to our core team. Carla Tucker, could you turn your camera on and wave to everyone? And could you tell everyone what you're most excited to learn about today? You have to unmute, you're still muted. There you go.
I just finished playing golf, so I'm most excited about having an ice cold beer. and learning about the stouts, because that is not one of my favorites. So I'm excited to find out about that.
Great, thanks, Carla. Carla is going to be working tirelessly to monitor the chat. So the more you drop in that chat, the more work she has to do. So go ahead and get chatty. All right, Stefano Mazzoni, if you could turn your camera on. Stefano has also been an integral part of this process. Can you tell us what you're most excited about today?
Sure. Thank you, everybody. I'm really excited because although I was part of the organizing committee, this happened from our panelists, which was that one of my top 3 favorite beers of all time is in the selection today. So I'm very excited about that. And also a beer that I generally do not like, which are on the opposite end of Carla's comment, or the Pilsners. So I'm hoping that maybe my appreciation will go up a little bit once I know some of the background and history. Maybe I've been tasting them wrong this whole time.
I feel similarly, Stefano. Thank you. So Stefano is going to be monitoring our word clouds and our polling, and he's going to be working tirelessly at that during the event. So give your thanks to him already. Kat Gould, could you wave and tell us what you're most excited about today?
Hi, everyone. I am most excited about sharing the next 90 minutes to many hours with all of you fellow geologists, and just the chance to drink beer and talk about 2 of my favorite things, geology and beer, together. So happy to be here. So thanks for having this, and thanks to all the organizing committee.
Thanks, Kat. And Kat will also be working tirelessly at our Q&A portion, and I'll explain how the Q&A works soon, but just know that the more questions you throw in, the more work you give her in a good way. So go ahead and throw those questions in. Nicole, if you have any interest, I did not give you a heads up, but if you're willing to turn your camera on and wave, and you don't have to, but if I hear her voice, I'll know she is going to turn her camera on. I want Nicole to get some recognition. She is the chair of our organization and makes everything happen. So I just wanted you to know that she's working in the background. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks, Rebecca.
All right, and then there is one more person on here, Dan, but he's going to talk later, so I'm going to give him the stage later. All right, let's move on. What's happening today? Obviously, we're going to be drinking beer, but after some brief introductions, we're going to have a beer tasting 101 run by Ed. We're also going to have a little lecture telling us what is beer, because this is really important in order to understand how the environment affects the beer. And then we'll go through the educational tasting. So as most of you know, we will go through a Pilsner, a Weizen Weiss, a Pale Ale, and a Stout. We will then have some time for additional Q&A with the panelists. So there will be some Q&A during the tasting. And we'll end with a big happy hour where we have an exciting platform that we'll be using to have some interactive networking going on, or just socializing. We don't need to use the word networking. Okay, hopefully a lot of you are excited about this. If you haven't read this yet, then you'll maybe be excited now, but we have these custom-made hydrobeerology pint glasses. And Dan, who I'm not sure if his video is on now, but like I said, I'm going to be giving him the stage later, but I just wanted to point out that Dan Kelleher was really the architect of this pint glass. The rest of us helped a bit, but the design was really his, and I'm really impressed with how these turned out. So we've made these custom-made glasses, and 100 random attendees will have the chance to get one of these for free, shipping and handling not included. After the event, we will randomly select the 100 attendees from the attendee list. And so keep your eyes peeled in your inbox from the email that you used to register to this event, because we will be contacting you to find out if you want it and what your shipping address is. All right. Now, the fun stuff, logistics. Today, most of the event will be in Zoom. If you are new to Zoom, here is an image to the left that highlights some of the features you might want to use. You can chat with each other, and as my current chat box has 80 unread notifications, I'm assuming that means y'all are doing it. So that's great, keep doing it. You can also ask a question, and that's in this Q&A button here. When you click that button, you can submit a question. You do have the option to make it anonymous. And you can also go to that box and upvote other people's questions. So if you see somebody whose question you like, rather than retyping it, upvote it, because we're going to ask the questions that have the most votes. So go ahead and drop your questions in the box. When you do, if they are for a specific panelist or about a specific beer, please make that at the very beginning of your question. For example, we want to ask the stout questions while we're talking about the stouts, and that'll just make it easier for logistics. Finally, I just want to let everyone know, even though Zoom told you when you logged in, that this event is being recorded and will be posted on the Women's Network YouTube channel, which if somebody could drop our YouTube channel link in the chat, I'd really appreciate it. Go there and check it out. We hosted the Geology of Wine a few months ago, and that event is on the YouTube channel, as well as some of our technical webinars. So go check them out. All right, what else we're gonna do? We're gonna do some word clouds. So if you've ever used a mentimeter.com, I think menti.com also works. We will give you the exact link and a QR code later. So don't stress about it yet. Keep sipping on your Pilsner. But we will be using this to get some ideas about where you guys are from and hear what you think about the Pilsner, the Pale Ale. So just keep your eyes out for that. And at the end of the event, we will have an interactive social hour using a Wonder Room, wonder.me, and we will give you that link at the end of the event. But if you're really excited and you want to research it, go research what it is right now. But I just guarantee you it's fun. The AAPG Women's Network is one of the co-hosts of this event today. If you're interested in joining us and helping us in forging our path and working on our mission, please go to this website here. Someone could drop this in the chat and click the Join the AAPG Women's Network button. This way to join will only work if you're an AAPG member. If you're interested in finding out how do I do that, or you have any other questions, go ahead and contact us. I think our contact information is on this page. We have some more exciting events coming up. We have launched the phase 2 of our mentoring program, which is really exciting. It was a huge success with the pilot that we ran this last year, and we just launched the second round now. If you're interested in partaking, please join by August 31st, and someone can drop the link in the chat. That would be great. We have a panel coming up focusing on how academic departments are responding to an evolving geoscience world on September 15th. We have too many events occurring at Image for me to type them all in here. We've got special sessions, networking, short course, luncheon. So check us out at Image, the conference for APG and SEG. And we've got a student-focused event in October about how to develop transferable skills to work in any industry. And very excitingly, because it's related to this event, we have another event coming up in November. I'm going to let Chris tell you very briefly about that event. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, we have the second of the wine series, the Geology of Wine series, where we're going to focus on caves and their importance with cheese and wine. So we're going to pair cave-aged cheeses with wines, and it's going to be super awesome. So save the date, November 12th.
Thank you, Chris. And as I already said, check us out on our YouTube channel because some of our past events are there. Whew, am I moving fast enough to get you guys to the fun part? I'm sweating. All right. Now, this is the first fun part, I think. As you can see, there's a QR code on your screen. You can use the QR code to sign into our Menti poll, or you can go to www.menti.com, M-E-N-T-I. Might be easiest to do this on a separate device like your phone. And you can enter that code there where it says 6722-3977. And we have a couple questions that we want to ask you because we want to learn about the audience. And it's a little too big of an audience to let everyone just turn their cameras on and talk, because that would take forever. So this we thought would be a fun way to learn about you. And I'm talking a little bit because I want to give you guys the time to log in and get set up. So hopefully you all are there now. I will say only answer the first couple questions. You'll get to a screen that says pause here and do exactly that. Don't keep going because those questions are for the tasting. All right, Stefano, do you want to steal the screen sharing if you can, or I can unshare my screen if you're ready. You're muted. I see your mouth moving.
Sorry, my control bar disappeared for Zoom, but can you hear me now?
Yes, and I can see your screen. There's a lot of Houston going on.
Excellent. And there's a lot of answers coming in. We got almost 200, just over 200 now. So keep them coming. This is great. Yeah, lots of Houston. Let's see here. Keep moving before I can read them. We got Argentina. I see Colombia. I saw, oh, there's Dunedin in New Zealand. This is exciting.
I saw someone in the chat say they're in from Thailand where it's 4 a.m. right now.
Yeah.
That's some dedication. Thanks for joining us.
Definitely. Yeah, this is great.
Anna?
So keep them coming. And then I will move on to the next one to see if we already have some respondents coming in. Keep these going. As they go along, we'll share the results at the end and maybe some other things. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. And we'll look at some styles of beer kind of ahead of this conversation. I see IPA, stout,
Yay.
Pilsner, pale ale, porter. Those are pretty strong.
What are some of the less common?
Sours and ciders. Free. I like the free beer. That's a good kind.
Wonder if those were grad students.
Cheap. As you not IPA. Almost all. Milkshake sour. I don't think I've tried a lot of these, but not that one.
I see iced tea wit beer.
Interesting. Sour beer, stout, pale ale. I'm guessing those are 3 styles. I don't know if anyone's mixed all 3 of those yet, but
Ed, have you ever seen one of those?
No.
So great. All right, and then last one for this early part is this is a before tasting. I know the Pilsner, maybe a little bit of sampling bias there. Some people, well, I hope everyone's already tasted their Pilsners, but this is kind of ahead of our tasting. We're going to see, oh, it's fun to see them kind of move. It looks like the little shoot the water gun in the clown's mouth at the fair, how they're moving. So yeah, there'll be another one of these later, actually, just to not to spoil too much, but you'll be able to rate the beers after you've gone through the educational tasting and see if we've seen any significant change. So great job, everybody.
Scientists, aren't we? We need data.
I don't know what these things are, but that's kind of exciting. Oh, these are number of people from 1 to 10.
Ah, that's so cool.
Yeah. And then you'll see the pause here. So you can take it back over, Rebecca.
Thank you, Stefano. All right, you should all see my screen. And I'm trying to, okay, I'm going to pass it off to Dan Kelleher. Dan, turn on your camera. Let's hear from you.
Rebecca.
There you are. All right.
Hello. Hey, I'm Dan Kelleher. I'm a hydrogeologist with Midwestgeosciences group. Shout out to all those familiar names on this broadcast. You know who you are. But I'd have a special shout out to Upland Brewing right here in Carmel, Indiana. And hello, Dan. Obscurity Brewing in Elburn, Illinois. Lithology Brewing on Long Island, New York. And Pacific Plate Brewing in Monrovia, California. Now, I do have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is this educational event does not qualify for continuing education units. But the good news is Midwest Geoscience Group does have some upcoming events that do indeed offer CEUs. Our first on-site events are next month on campus at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. It's 3 different professional training events, all scheduled in the same week. Each are dedicated to the hydrogeology of fractured bedrock, ranging from a classroom course on contaminant fate and transport to a personalized field workshop that teaches us how to use hydrophysical and geophysical tools. We are nearing the early registration deadline, so don't wait. Next slide, please. Then on September 30th, we're going to move stuff online. And we begin an online aquifer testing course in partnership with In Situ and Northern Illinois University. There are 6 course modules, tutorials, and a final exam that totals 10 contact hours. So if you do aquifer testing, this is a unique learning experience you don't want to miss. Next slide, please. But leading up to the thing I'm most excited about, is this totally new online certificate course. And in case you're not aware, the US Environmental Protection Agency published a 2017 document outlining environmental sequence stratigraphy. And despite its tremendous merit, there have been some unspoken challenges that have plagued some professionals from implementing it and maximizing it. Midwest Geosciences Group, we're going to tackle those challenges by stepping through strategies to help people implement environmental sequence stratigraphy. And as you might guess, it all begins with deciphering depositional environments, translating the story the sediments are telling onto meaningful boring logs, right? That's what we're hired to do. And this training experience goes much farther than that. Registration will open next week. Thank you for the opportunity to share some upcoming events with you.
Thank you, Dan. If I haven't made it clear, Dan has been a huge part of planning this event, such a major part. And so thank you so much, Dan. We love your input. He's part of the committee and he's made huge, huge contributions.
Thank you to AAPG.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Hopefully you all enjoyed that part. But now it's time to move on to the beer specific part. And in order to do that, we need to meet our panelists because they're more than just these beautiful faces on the screen. Who do we have first? I think I know who it is. Oh, look, it's Adam. Go ahead, Stefano, introduce
So,
Adam.
Yeah, no, awesome. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Adam Turner. Adam has a PhD in geochemistry from LSU. Yeah, I'm unmuted, good. And you can read all his work experience there. I'll just give you some personal connection stories and why he's a super awesome panelist. I actually met Adam over beers at the home of a few geologists while he was working at ExxonMobil. So, geology and beer was at the outset of our friendship. I reached out to him when we were putting this panel together because of his extensive knowledge in both beer and geochemistry. And actually, while reaching out to him, I found out that he was helping out at Buffalo Bayou Brewing Company. So even more on the spot in terms of a perfect person to invite. And then now he's working for GeoMark. They're lucky to have his geochemistry expertise. I hear they're not really using him to make any beer for them, maybe not yet. There might be a special release or something, an event maybe, but who knows? But he's doing other geochemistry, non-beer geochemistry for them. So welcome, Adam, and we're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm working on the special label beer right now. It'll come out in no time.
All right, you guys will hear more from Adam later. So let's move on to our next panelist, Janine Weber.
Awesome. So yeah, here we go. Dr. Janine Weber, she received her undergraduate degree from NAU and a master's from Mines, and then went to get her PhD at UC Berkeley. I'm also another UC school, but we're fellow UC grads. And throughout her career in energy and resource exploration, she's worked as a geologist, geophysicist, a structural geologist, an integrator, really awesome technical person. She left the industry recently, left the oil and gas, the resource industry recently to pursue her passion and follow up on her years of experience in home brewing. She started a new brewery in Houston, which is set to open soon. I'm not going to say when, but hopefully Janine can be us on that.
I keep hoping it's going to be before the end of the year, but
totally
probably the beginning of next.
Yeah, but please, look them up. I know they have a Facebook page. Keep up with them there. And, like you saw in that word cloud, we have a lot of Houston represented in this call. So once it opens, let's get out there and support her. So welcome.
Thank you.
I'll be knocking on your door. All right.
Here.
So of course you'll hear more from Jeanine as well soon. So let's go ahead and introduce our third and final panelist. And Dan, go ahead and take it away.
What a privilege to introduce Dr. Ed Herrmann, who is the executive director at the Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Plus, he's an associate research scientist in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Now, Dr. Herrmann is uniquely qualified to teach us today about the geology of beer because some of his recent research interests are geoarchaeology, and he teaches courses called Archaeology and Appreciation of Beer and Great Fermentations. Awesome. When I did a Google search to prepare this intro for Dr. Herrmann, I learned that his list of publications, awards, and recognitions are way too long to list here, but it's important to note that he's dedicated to geoscience education and scientific advances at all levels. And today's session is another step in that advancement. So at this time, please help me welcome our first panelist today, broadcasting live from beautiful Bloomington, Indiana, Dr. Ed Herrmann.
Thank you, Dan. So what I'm going to do is start kind of where I left off. We're going to talk a little bit about tasting. And Rebecca, go ahead and advance that, please. And the
You
interesting
interrupted my
part
sip of beer.
about tasting is that we're going to be talking about tasting techniques and the way to sort of help us perceive flavor. And it's the type of thing that might change your life, because it's the same way that we taste everything that we actually eat and drink. And I'll be asking you to think a little bit as we go through this. So go ahead, Rebecca. This next slide is the one that you have seen already, and I'm going to take a second and talk just a little bit more about it. In particular, the one on the right. The areas that sort of show up here as where we taste certain flavors aren't quite exactly right, but the idea is that we do taste and perceive flavors in different places. And notice just under the teeth how I got bitter written there. And what's interesting is we kind of perceive bitter character, and in some cases astringency, which is sort of a mouthfeel sensation, in places that aren't just on our tongue, like the roof of our mouth or in between our gums and our cheeks. So as we're going through this, these are the types of things that we're going to think about as we actually taste. And Rebecca, will you bring up the next one on this slide? If you were to, what we're looking at here are the sort of cavities that make up our taste buds on our tongue. And if you've ever looked at your tongue and opened your mouth wide, look at it in the mirror, you'll notice in the back of your tongue, you have these relatively large taste buds. And what actually happens is the space within is a little bit larger. So when we talk about some flavors that linger, like bitter is one of them that tends to linger in your mouth, quite often what's happening is there's just a little more beer that is stuck in the reservoir that is the part of your taste bud. And so that's an interesting part of flavor when we think about it. And it's also helps us differentiate tasting beer compared to tasting other things. For instance, tasting beer tends to be a little bit more complex in some ways than tasting wine. And for instance, the bitter character is something that's often not found in wine, at least if the wine's good. So wine tasters can often move the wine around in their mouth and spit it out. It's a lot harder for beer tasters to do that because we need to be able to perceive the quality of the bitter character that we're tasting, because bitter is so important. We'll get into that in a little bit, but there's a lot of ways of creating different types of bitter flavors in beers. And this understanding where you're tasting those bitter characters can help us understand the creation of those beers. So go ahead, Rebecca, and move on to the next one, if you would. So you've heard some of this already. Again, a big part of when we taste is making sure we understand the aroma and making sure that we're trying to get as much of that aroma in as we possibly can, because that's going to accentuate flavors that we have. We take relatively short sniffs so that we don't get acclimated, so that we can begin to pick out and decipher nuances. Instead of taking a lot of big breaths in to smell it, we take just shorter sniffs. And then when we're talking with friends, one of the best things to do is to describe those flavors in objective terms, in terms of things that you know the flavors of, and hopefully the people you're hanging out with also sort of understand those flavors. Hey, Rebecca? But perhaps even more important is it's okay just to enjoy your beer too. You know, we don't have to get all anal about it. And what we're trying to do here today is just sort of give you an introduction and a way to perhaps increase enjoyment and the pleasure on your own. Okay. So once we're done with the smell, now it's time to sort of to get some of that beer in your mouth. And the idea is to go ahead, sip, that's not quite the right word, but we want to, again, saturate your tongue, don't swallow immediately, and sort of note what you're sensing. Sometimes it's a carbonation level, sometimes it's some really strong flavor, other times it might be the weight of a beer on your tongue. But in any event, while that beer's in your mouth, you do want to sort of exhale, and that will again take some of the carbon dioxide that might still be in solution, take it out of solution, and as it comes out of solution, it'll bring with it certain other flavors. And we talk then in terms of describing these beers and what it is that we're detecting, and quite often it's nice to talk about where on the tongue we're perceiving flavors. For instance, right now, I have a relatively strong, I'm drinking the Pilsner Urquell, and I'm hoping most people are still drinking some sort of lager. And the nice thing about a Pilsner is it balances malt character with some of the hop character. And what I'm getting right now in my mouth is a little bit of a bitter character that's lingering towards the back of my throat and on the back of my tongue, and also some sweet character that's a little closer towards the front of my tongue. And that sweet character is the result of malted barley. And we'll talk a little bit about that process later on, but there's certain sugars inherent in these beers that can't be fermented by the yeast. And those are sugars that sort of remain left over for us to enjoy. And so in any event, if you wait a little while and you say you have a glass, somebody was talking about glasses a little while ago. If you leave the beer sit in the glass for a little while, it'll warm up. And if you try it again in 15, 20 minutes, there'll be some different flavors that you'll perceive that perhaps because it's cold right now, you might not be able to perceive. The glassware, different beers do a little bit better in different glasses. Pilsner, the best way of drinking it, according to most people, professionals in the industry, is from a straight-sided glass. This allows, there's a lot of details here. We don't quite have time to get into a lot of the details, but basically what happens is as some of the flavors come out of the beer, they get into your nose in certain ways as you're drinking. And for a Pilsner, some of the very best flavors that we get are from a very subtle or slow kind of curve or a straight-sided glass, in my opinion. Becca? So we will be talking about the geology of beer. And as we go through this today, some of us will be talking about different things. We'll be addressing certain questions related to how the earth and perhaps where we are on the earth, where breweries are on the earth, affects the flavor of the beer, beer terroir, if you will. In some cases, it's related directly to the environment in which the grains are grown. Is it grown in alluvium? Is that alluvium perhaps volcanic? These will all affect the flavors of the beers due to the chemistry of the waters, of the actual minerals that are in some of the soils. So we will be talking about that. Perhaps the most important part is water chemistry. Beer is mostly water. Different beers sort of require different types of water. And what I mean by that is different inclusions in the water, if you will, whether we're dealing with minerals, salts, or other even organisms in some cases. Climate. Climate has a lot to do with barley and how barley grows. How much starch is in that grain compared to how much husk? And that will affect the flavor of a beer. There's other grain qualities too, like how much malt extract can be actually taken from it, what types of sugars possibly can be produced later on. Similar with hops, where it's grown, how much light it gets, how much water it gets, all of that is related to where the hops might actually be grown. And finally, in your local environment, we have yeast. Yeast, there's wild yeast in some cases, and if we're talking about the role of yeast in some of the first fermentations we know about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, it's really important to understand that some of those wild yeast strains and even bacteria that were fermenting these beers had flavors that people appreciated. They weren't disgusting. So in other places, like in Indiana, I've tried often to sort of brew a beer out in the open, and we don't quite create those flavors that are very palatable in this neck of the woods. But in other places, it really does, and it matters so much. Rebecca? Not only does geology affect beer, but we also know that beer affects geology. Look at what we're doing here right now, and think about field school, field work, and the bullshit sessions at conferences. Think about how much geology was discovered, thought about, and discussed over a beer. So we also have to realize that beer affects geology too. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about beer, and we're going to talk a lot more about it. So I'm going to kind of fly through this some, and go ahead, Rebecca, with the next one. This one's going to talk about some of the different things that are in a beer. I think you'll notice, obviously, malted barley. There's some wheat. There's occasionally, of course, hops. There's lots of other things that are added. But in the upper right, you'll see a few yeast cells. And yeast, interestingly, we have completely different, many different yeast strains. And if we want to be lumpers instead of splitters, we can lump into two categories. And go ahead, Rebecca, ale yeasts or lager yeasts. And these work under different conditions. Ale yeast, for instance, is a yeast that ferments sort of at the top of a fermenter. It requires oxygen, so it's aerobic, and runs through a slightly different metabolic pathway than, say, lager yeast, which ferment from the bottom. They're anaerobic, and the lager yeast take a lot longer to actually ferment because they work best at colder temperatures, temperature being a catalyst in that reaction. So lager yeasts also tend to ferment out a little bit more because they're fermenting for a long time and they have different qualities that often create a slightly drier beer. Ales tend to be somewhat more fruity. There's a lot of detail, but I'm flying over here. We could perhaps talk about some of that later on. The basic brewing process is what we're trying to do with a starch grain. And I'm going to contrast this to wine. In wine, we already have sugars. These sugars are already inherent in the fruit, and those sugars, many of them are already fermentable and can simply be fermented by yeast or wild yeast or even bacteria. Beer, it's completely different. And actually, this is part of how we define beer, that starches that are unfermentable need to be converted into sugars that are fermentable. And what's kind of fun, go ahead, Rebecca, is the idea that inherent in the grain of malted barley is these long chain polymers of starch. And the starch can be broken up. The arrows that just showed up are where the large molecules can be cleaved to create, for instance, a glucose molecule. So one of those three is a glucose. But if we have two, we got something called maltose. That's a different sugar. There's another one that often gets produced called maltotriose. And these are fermentable sugars, but some aren't. And those are the ones that we taste later on. And what's really cool about brewing, I mean, there's a lot of things, but one thing about the mash is that these enzymes that are found only in barley, we don't have them in corn or rice or wheat, they have enzymes that are inherent in these grains. And these enzymes are what actually convert the starch to sugar. But these enzymes can be controlled by a brewer based on the temperature of the mash. So we have grain that gets cracked, we add water to it at a very specific temperature in order to create a very specific sugar. And we can alter the temperature of the mash to create a few different sugars. And then there's other techniques. The Germans use this technique called decoction, to where they can actually cook some of the mash and create even more intense multi flavors. Some of the malt companies might argue that, but there's no doubt that decoction mashing will increase the malt character of a beer. So once you have a mash, we need to separate the liquid that we call wort from the husk and the grain. That goes over into a boil kettle, where we then later on will boil our wort. It's called wort at this point because it's not fermented yet. Once it gets fermented, we call it beer. But the wort gets brought over into a boil kettle where we might add things. In the case of a wheat beer, like a wit style, we might add coriander or orange peel. In most of our beers, that's where we're adding hops. And you add hops at different times during the boil to get slightly different flavors. Once the boil is done, the wort is cooled down, and it's cooled down to the same temperature that the yeast likes to work. Once it's cooled down to the temperature that the yeast is used to, those are mixed in a fermenter somewhere, and then the fermentation process begins to take place. And what happens then is the yeast will eat those sugars, the sugars that it can, create carbon dioxide and alcohol, and eventually will allow that to condition for a period of time. And once that beer is ripe, the brewery will begin to package it in one way or another. Now, go ahead, Rebecca. This is a technique that today in a modern brewery, if we start on the upper left and move immediately to the right, the grain comes from a silo. It gets milled. The mashing process, the lautering is how we separate the wort from the grains. Where it says brewing, what they mean is boiling. Then it gets cooled, fermented, conditioned, and packaged. So that's kind of how it looks from the commercial brewing standpoint. Go ahead, Rebecca. And this is the same that's been happening for thousands of years. What's interesting is here on the left, the Egyptians would sometimes, there's about 38 recipes that we know of from Egypt. They brewed light beers, dark beers, and beers with different ingredients, different grains. But what we do know is they would often bake bread first and then brew from that. So what they were able to do is utilize the sugars that were created in part through fermentation, but fermentation in the loaf. And then, of course, through the Middle Ages, you can see the way it was done. The one on the right with a grain hopper above, and then someone in the mash tun making sure it mixed with the water in the right way. Okay, and I think that covers it for a brief rundown on the process. Cheers.
And yes, cheers.
Prost.
Ed, Prost. So Ed, clearly we're not going fast enough because I almost finished my Pilsner and we weren't supposed to finish it yet. Or I'm drinking too fast. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Ed. Ed I've probably personally talked to Ed for many, many hours in my life about beer, and I'm sure he could talk even more. So trust us when we say that was a brief overview. Later in the event, we will share, the panelists have graciously allowed us to share their contact information, which is wonderful. So if your questions don't get answered today and you have additional questions, you can contact the panelists later. But for now, we're going to move on. Hopefully you haven't finished your Pilsner because now it's time to describe what it tastes like and learn a little more about Pilsner specifically. All right, so I think Ed and Stefano are going to start off with another Menti meter. And so Stefano shared his screen. Hopefully you guys still have your Menti meter up on your other device. If not, the code is at the top. And we're going to see what you, actually, I'm not supposed to say this part. Ed, tell people what to describe.
Well, I'm happy also to get some of the other panelists involved in some of the flavor descriptors. But I think people have done a pretty good job talking about it. This particular beer tends to be very crisp. And what's really fun about this beer is one of the first lagers ever on Earth. These guys somehow were able to control and then domesticate this yeast strain that ferments at colder temperatures and really makes a crisp beer. Yes, it is somewhat bitter. And I particularly, I'm getting that on my tongue. And I do get a little bit of sour on the sides, sort of on the sides of my tongue. And the wonderful malt character that's sort of riding on the top of my tongue and towards the front.
Yeah, you definitely get both a slight sweetness from the malt and that quite bold bitterness from the specifically the Saaz hops that are used in this. And they use a lot of Saaz hops. Saaz, S-A-A-Z. Yeah, that's classic for what this beer always features. Yep.
I like the terms that we're using in the word cloud, that instead of like, I like it, I don't like it, we're using objective terms. That's always helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Then shall we move back into
Quick note on the Menti meter though, keep describing your Pilsner, but I don't have a pause here slide, but wait, because there'll be another one of these for each beer. So don't move ahead, please.
Yes, do not describe the beers you haven't tasted yet. All right. So next we have Adam. Adam is back, right? We had a little bit of a digital situation there, and Adam's computer restarted right before he was supposed to start talking, but he's back. So thank you for that. So here, go ahead, Adam, take it away.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I got the blue screen of death saying I had to update, so that was exciting. All right, so I think the vast majority of us are geologists on this line, if not the entire majority of us. And so this is nothing new, but 90 some odd percent, 96%, 94% of beer is water. And so it really is one of the most important of the ingredients that we work with. And there's three real sources of water that come for drinking water, but especially in our case, brewing water. And that's precipitation, surface water, and aquifers. Now, each of these sources are going to have their own chemistries and their own ions that are associated with them. When you think of precipitation, it's going to be, pretty pure hydrogen and oxygen coming out of the sky, maybe a little bit of dust associated with it, but not much else. Surface water is going to have runoff of all kinds of who knows what, dead fish, organics, pieces of ions, lots of stuff. And then the thing that I think is most interesting, and the source that I think most brewers actually, at least historically, got their water from, were aquifers. And aquifers, depending on the type of material that makes up the aquifer and the time period that the water will spend in the aquifer, have a huge impact on the chemistry of that water. And we'll see in a second how that chemistry actually can affect the beer. So go ahead and jump to the next one, Rebecca. So this is just an example from USGS data showing the many different types of aquifers across the US. And I've seen some comments in the chat already about how the aquifers differ across the US. Some people have great water and poor water, but really the biggest impact, at least historically, has been the geology of these aquifers. You can see it kind of breaks down into three major categories here. We've got carbonate-based aquifers, and we've got sandstone-based aquifers, and we've got hard rock-based aquifers, and some type of mix between them. The thing that's really interesting though is if you're in any kind of a carbonate aquifer, you have an opportunity for your water to start dissolving that aquifer and incorporating some of those ions into the water. So we see here that there's a term called water hardness, and it's a little bit confusing for geologists because soft rocks make hard water, right? But I think anyone that's kind of been in a cave before understands how this works, where you have your water that comes in to some type of limestone matrix, dissolves out your ions, and that material has to go somewhere, and it can be reprecipitated down the line, or it can stay in the water as ions and contribute to that total hardness of the water. So go ahead, Rebecca, to the next one. So historically, we had these great beer making regions across Europe, and the types of beers that were produced were really reliant on the water sources that they had. So right now we're all drinking Pilsner. I hope everyone's got a little bit left. The dregs, yeah, exactly. So Pils are come from Pilsen in Czechoslovakia there. Historically very soft water. So that's very low concentrations of dissolved ions in it. And this really allowed them to use a specific type of light malt that gives it such a unique kind of crisp and soft mouthfeel. Now, if you go somewhere like Ireland, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what your preference in beer tastes are, the water was much harder. And so in order to reach the proper mash pHs to convert those sugars with the enzymes that Ed was talking about, you needed a little bit darker malt to contribute some more acidity to that mash to reach the proper pHs. So that's why we have our light beer from Pilsen and our dark beers with the more acidic malt we'll talk about a little bit later over coming from Dublin. Kind of as a fun aside, now modern breweries can kind of change chemistries however they feel. But the kind of the pioneers of that were in Burton, Upton, Trent in the UK in the 1800s. We know about this because there's actually kind of an infamous libel suit in which the breweries there were accused of altering their beer, putting stuff into it, adjuncts and whatnot. And so they had to reveal their water treatment style of kind of adjusting the salts in their water to prove that they weren't altering their product. Go ahead, Rebecca, thanks.
All right. So, yeah, I guess it's my turn now to talk about the history, right?
You were just going to share a brief little
Very
fun story. Yeah, that's about Pilsner's kicking off a revolution. Yeah.
So back in the 1840s, there was a lot of changes. There's industrial revolution going on. There's people were making things in big scale. And prior to that, there were lots of local breweries, and they used locally malted barley, and it was mostly brown because they toasted it when they were kilning it, and it just a lot of it was brown and quality wasn't very good. Right about 1840s time, the folks in Pilsen, which is now Czechia, they decided they didn't want this stuff anymore, and they hired a really good brewer from Germany, brought him over, built a new brewery for the community. It was a community brewery. And this guy, Josef Groll, came from a brewing family, and he was raised in this. He knew what was going on, and he'd been following, because he did his research, and he found that the water there was very, very soft, and he wanted to use very, very pale malts. And so luckily, the soft water plus the very pale, lightly kilned malt came together to make this and he brought yeast with him from Germany, which was the bottom fermenting lager yeast. So that combination turned into this beautiful golden, and the whole area is surrounded with these Sots hops farms. And so they had plenty of wonderful hops, and those ingredients all came together to create this thing, which was truly different because everything else was malty, dark, and kind of cruddy. And it went sour really fast. So this was a new thing, and it took the world by storm, and the rest is history, because all your macro beers, they look like this. I'm done.
Thanks, Janine. All right, we're gonna, at this point, we'd like to take some questions from the audience about Pilsners. I'm gonna kick it over to Kat, unless she's busy furiously looking at the questions. But Kat, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. We have had some really fantastic questions that some of them we're able to answer on the fly, and some of them I'm just tallying because they're general questions. So why don't I just pop, I just had a couple come through specifically about Pilsners. So I know Ed answered one of them already, but how about I'll pop this one to you so you can answer for everyone to see, Ed. So someone asked if Pilsner was a lager. So do you want to go ahead and answer that? And maybe expand a little bit on how there's some bit of a confusion between the two? I think, Ed, you answered that one. Oh, you've got to unmute.
I did. But yes is the answer. Pilsner is a lager. And the idea here, and Janine was kind of getting at this, is the Pilsner yeast is a pretty specific type of yeast. There are other lager yeasts that ferment at the cold temperatures. And if any of you know English lagers, they have a pretty distinctively different character.
Yeah.
It's just a slightly different strain of yeast. Now, they're both might be lagers, but the Pilsner yeast is a specific type of lager yeast.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have time for any more, Rebecca, or should we move on?
As I'm chewing,
Are you cleansing your palate?
And it's funny because that's the question I wanted you to ask about.
Why don't I go ahead and ask that then? All right, so panelists, what is your advice on cleansing your palate between beers? So we're about to switch beers. So how would we best cleanse our palates and get ready for the next beer? Why don't I start? I'll start with Janine. How would you cleanse your palate, Janine?
So I like pretzels. Pretzels are really good. They're salty and they have that nice weedy crunch that will kind of shred your mouth a little. And but also water, just good old purified, nice, clean, cool water, not too cold, because you don't want to freeze your taste buds.
Perfect. All right, Adam, how would you cleanse your palate? Something similar or anything to add?
No, Janine killed it. Yep, absolutely. Just a glass of water is the best way to do it, I think. But again, don't overthink it. Like I was saying earlier, if it's if you don't have a glass of water, we paired these beers up to go in the right order, so it shouldn't blow out your palate anyway. So enjoy.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm sure there's a million more questions, but for the purposes of time, we're going to keep moving. But keep asking those questions. We have more time set aside later for questions, so we might get to it. All right. What is the next beer? Who remembers? Oh, Ed remembers. It's the Weizen.
Ah, nice.
So if you're like me and you have your makeshift cooler, which you can't really see very well, but I have my beers right next to me. Go ahead, get out your Weizen.
I have to go fetch my Weizen. Sorry.
I've got my Franziskaner. Sorry, it keeps disappearing into my virtual background, but all right. So go ahead and get it out. And Ed, how about instead of me continuing to talk, you tell everyone how to pour their beer.
All right. So Weizen. Weizen is a beer that is not filtered. It's a beer that we want to consume the yeast. The yeast is part of the flavor of this beer, and it's really important that we get the yeast into this beer. There's different types of Weizen beers. Some that they call Cristal, which is a type that actually has no yeast in it. It's like crystal clear. But that's not what we're drinking here today. What we're drinking is beer with yeast, either the Franziskaner or perhaps something like a Weihenstephan. Now, this beer, they tend to have yeast that's towards the bottom. So swirl it and get it stirred up off the bottom. If you have a can, some people like to roll it. But in doing so, a Hefeweizen, Hefe means yeast, Weizen means wheat. So this is a beer that's brewed with some barley in order to get the enzymes and create any sugars, but also a large portion of wheat is in there. Stir it up, and there's a lot of carbon dioxide in a wheat beer. There's more in a wheat beer than just about any other style. So when we pour it, we actually want a slightly bigger head. And I like to pour a Hefeweizen in a classic German style, where it actually comes and stands up a little bit over the edge of the glass. It takes a little while to pour it, but your beer should look a little bit cloudy like mine. That is what it should look like.
Is this too much?
It's a little bit much, but that's okay. And this is just a wonderful way of drinking it. People asked about glasses before. The Weizen glass tends to be slightly rounded and come in a little bit towards the top. That helps keep a lot of the volatiles in it right near your nose. So instead of letting them go like the Pilsner does, these glasses tend to sort of capture the CO2 as it's coming out, and it keeps it right around your nose. So cheers. Again, Prost, zum Wohl.
And as you're tasting, we're going to switch back over to Stefano with the Menti poll. That was a face that made me think you weren't ready for that, Stefano. Sorry.
No, I was working on our
map.
things,
Everyone, go back to your Menti.
No, you're fine. I'm right here.
Okay.
This beer is brewed with an ale yeast. Tends to be a little bit fruitier, and specific to this yeast strain and various temperatures that it might be fermented at. I see people have come up with a lot of the flavors that are really typical for this style.
I taste banana. I was not expecting that. And then I saw other people say it, and then I realized I wasn't crazy, or we're just all crazy. So.
I'm drinking also the Franziskaner. I'm getting a little bit of a sort of a green apple character to it on the sides of my tongue, like a sourish. What's interesting, we got the banana listed here. Banana comes from a certain ester that's brewed, that is a part of the brewing process. It's called isomyl acetate. Well, that same compound is in bananas. I mean, it's part of the reason that we want to describe these flavors and talk about them is quite often we know, hey, we're saying it tastes like banana. Well, there's a reason for it. It has some of the same exact compounds. I enjoy Weizen styles in the summertime because of the sour character. They're sour. The pH is also tends to be an awful lot lower than many other beers. The character of the water is also so important to the flavors here. Adam, you want to talk about that some?
And should I go back to the slides, or actually we don't have any pictures for you to talk to. So yeah, we can keep this up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you think about the kind of the typical aquifers you'd be pulling from, it definitely has a huge impact. Yeah.
So because this is a timely point, panelists, there are some people in the chat suggesting that participants may want to take the next two beers out of their fridge now to let them start to warm up a bit. Is that something you all suggest? Okay. Thank you, whoever dropped that in the chat. I missed your name. I really appreciate the tip. So panelists, or not panelists, audience, take the next two beers out and let them start to come to room temperature. Just repeating in case you hadn't heard that. Great.
Hey, Ed, what's the best temperature to drink specific beers at? Is it like wine, where depending on the wine style, you have a specific temperature range you want to have the beer?
So beer temperature for consumption varies on according to style, and of course your preference, right? It's all about what you prefer. I've heard people talk about warm beers. The only warm beer I've ever heard of is wassail, and it's something that you do that's like a spiced beer during a holiday season. But even the English, who tend to drink beers warmer than others, at cellar temperature, it's still somewhere around 55 for the ales that they consume. So for ales in general and Fahrenheit, I'm talking right now, probably somewhere around 48 to 50. And for some of the darker beers, I tend to like them even a little bit warmer. For Pilsners or other forms of lagers, I tend to like those at about refrigerator temperature, somewhere between 38, 42, something like that in Fahrenheit.
All right. Shall we go ahead with your regularly scheduled chatting, Ed?
Yeah, sure thing. So Rebecca, are you talking about a little more on beer flavor?
Yeah, unless you feel like you've already finished all of this. I didn't know if that was just a response.
We haven't talked a lot about the spicy character.
Then let's talk about that.
So I noticed in the word cloud that people were talking about things like spicy flavors. I think I saw clove. Some people might have mentioned nutmeg. That's something that some people sometimes pick out of this beer, and this is a byproduct of fermentation, and that's part of the fun of the different yeast strains is they produce different. They actually sort of inject into beers different flavors, and these spicy characters are a part of the yeast strain, the Hefeweizen strain of yeast that can produce these flavors, and they can be enhanced or diminished based on certain things that brewers might do, by salts that might be in the water. So another way that the geology might affect it, but also by temperatures at which you might ferment. And again, sort of the terroir. If you're living in an area that's pretty warm, you're going to get a lot more of these phenols or these sort of strong, spicy flavors, just like you might get more fruity flavors at the higher temperatures as well.
Okay.
Good comments. Good comment. Good comments in the chat.
There's a lot going in the chat.
Yeah.
Agreed. Do we want to take some? You want to talk about some of the questions that we have coming in, Ed? Kat, do you have anything in particular that you want to pass on to the panelists?
Yeah, I can throw a couple your guys' way. Let's see. So someone asked, any tips for boosting the clove flavor? I don't know if that's in brewing because they're speaking to under pitching or stressing the yeast. So
yeah, that's definitely a brewer. That's a home brewer
question.
Yeah, definitely. It is very much temperature controlled. Stressing the yeast is really difficult to do intentionally because people have a tendency to overdo it, overstress it, or it's just really hard in a homebrew situation. Pro brewers can do it because they do yeast counts. But Ed, do you know, or Adam, do you know the exact temperatures to get clove versus banana? And clove is slightly colder, banana slightly warmer, but I can't remember the temps.
Yeah, I don't know the temps off the top of my head, but like you said, in a homebrew situation, it's so hard to control your temperatures that it's, putting a wet towel around your fermenter is about the best you can hope for.
Yeah, what I've been doing for years, over 10 years now, is I have a small chest freezer dedicated as my fermentation. Actually, I have 5 of them now. Dedicated fermentation chambers. Because I'm crazy. So
it's not a fridge, it's a fermentation chamber.
Yes, it is a fermentation chamber with a temperature override so you can maintain precise control. Yeah. Pretty nice.
Okay.
I'll add one thing for Corey is different yeast strains do have different characters. So the Franziskaner yeast strain is a little bit harder to get big banana out of than the Weinstefan strain. For instance, Schneider out of Munich also, it's a little more difficult to get the banana character if that's what you're going for. But increased temperature on the ferment will get you more banana. The clove, I think, I have a hard time figuring that one out.
This thing, when I pour it, it's got some big floaties, technical term, floaties. And which is not always a thing you want in your beer, but you got to remember that this stuff sat in a boat in a container and came across the waves to reach us. So it sat in this bottle for a long time. That yeast kind of clumped down in the bottom to make sort of a, crusty, a subaqueous crust, sub-beer crust, which when you pour vigorously, that'll come out. But it's okay. All it does is it causes you to be a little more flatulent later. That's all.
Good for the digestion. Cleans you out. Okay, Rebecca, time for one more, or are we?
There's no known pathogens that live in beer. There's nothing that can hurt you. It's okay.
Nothing that can hurt you. It's all good.
Safe.
Yeah, let's go with one more question. We're surprisingly not that far behind schedule.
Okay,
I'm
going to be, okay, I'll ask a question that I like this question, and it's not specifically about Weisens, but I'll ask anyway. Do you folks think that the advent of microbreweries has brought back more historic brews? So are people being a little bit more brave? And what are your thoughts on that, panelists?
Oh yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because okay, so as a brewer, so you guys I know have already done your pro gigs, but me stepping into it as a new pro is like, we want to do something unusual to stand out and be different. You need to be different or people aren't going to come in and drink your beer. You also have to have a good hazy IPA. That's just required. So we'll have that. But, if we can revive some weird thing that no one's ever heard of, it's that is very trending now. I've never tried that before. I've got to try that. So you got to find some gizmo like that to pull people in. But it's fun too.
Yeah, it seems like the more breweries that pop up, the more creativity comes with it. And it's been really impressive seeing the new styles. I mean, brut IPAs, that and hazy IPAs and all these things that they've been around, but they've been kind of delegated off into the corner of the very boutique type stuff. And you see some of these come out in the mainstream, and it's really exciting.
Well, like a Goza, which is a kettle sour, which is really great. It's a slightly salty, soured beer. It's soured with lactobacillus, which is also, same thing that you have in your yogurt, although it's slightly different strain. And that mixed with fruit is the hot thing for summer beers. It's a fruity kettle sour. And it's all the rage. And that was a revived ancient style. Well, not that, but old. Yeah.
Yeah, gotta get those electrolytes in,
Yeah, it works good. That's a very pleasant way of getting your electrolytes.
Yeah, definitely.
Janine, I particularly like those. And thinking about how, if we think about the fermented beverages, like in prehistory, we go back thousands of years, those drinks would have been very memorable for people. It would have been a new sort of flavor. The phenomenology of it is just fantastic. And the sour character you don't get from a lot of different things. So it would have been just like groundbreaking when people first started controlling fermentation. Yeah. Those flavors that would have been very sour, that would have been relatively low in alcohol, and it probably also would have had a slightly smoky character, because the only way to actually malt the grain and help create the opportunity for the creation of those sugars is to do so near a fire. You might have been able to heat up a rock, but the idea was that it would have been smoky also. So when you start thinking about, the kettle sours or the other types of sours, that it really does approximate beers in prehistory, which of course is something I love as an archaeologist, right?
Yeah. So one of the, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to do a slight diversion here because it just fits right in here. One of the things that I did, being a geologist, I'm like, yes, how do we use rocks to make beer? So I found myself a nice collection of smooth river rocks that were Precambrian, very fine-grained basalts. They were very old. I think they were very old. No, there was a variety of things, but what I did was I found very fine-grained, super rounded river rocks in Arizona. So some of those are very old rocks. And I heated them up to over 400 degrees, so way hotter than water gets. Water only boils at 212. So if you throw a little heat monster into your kettle at 400, 500, 600 degrees, you get this massive boiling and charring that goes around the rock. And you can create all kinds of fantastic flavors. It's called Stein beer, rock beer, so geological. And I mean, you have to choose the right rocks. Otherwise you get rocks that like blow up on you and stuff, and that's no good. But I just, I've had a lot of fun playing with those brewing stones, and it's very
That's
geological.
so cool. That's really cool, Janine. Thank you for sharing that story.
So
That's
we'll
pretty
go back
inspiring.
to the
Heat monsters, yes. Okay, Rebecca, I'll punt it back to you here.
Thank you. Okay, that was great, guys.
Oh,
We just
we're gonna go on to
lost you
the-
there, Rebecca.
Would you like to hear what I'm saying when my mouth moves? Sorry, I just got a notification that I was muted. Okay, so I don't know if anyone heard me, but Phil, let's go. I've gotten a note from Stefano that he's finished the map, which is super exciting. And so I want everyone to know that once we're done tasting these beers, we are going to see where all our participants are from. But in the meantime, Stefano, are you ready to share the next word cloud? While you're hearing me and catching up, because I see you're sending me messages at the same time.
No, yes.
So while he's getting ready to do that, Janine, would you like to tell everybody how to pour their pale ale and how to taste it?
So the next beer is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is really one of, I think, America's great treasures. And it is, it's not an IPA, but you know what? This was here kind of before IPAs became the thing. And for many people, I'm trying to get it in focus here. For many folks, the sensation of the hops and the bitterness of this beer is equivalent to many IPAs today, or it may be even stronger than some things that are called IPA. So I'm pouring it into my favorite glass, which is a gold-rimmed goblet. Not the appropriate IPA glass, but I don't care because it's my favorite glass. And you do want to pour it.
Did I do better on the head this time?
Yes, that's good. That's good. So yeah, if you don't want to pour too much head, you kind of tip your glass a little and you pour down the side at first. And then if you want to make more head, then you do pour kind of straight down. But you don't want to start pouring straight down because then you get too much head.
I'm pouring mine into a glass of the Sierra Nevadas. So
awesome. All right, do you want to, okay, so now we're getting the descriptions. Oh, you know, it always amazes me how clean and how punchy. I mean, it's just bright and it's just such a solid beer. It balances the malt with the hops. And these hops are very, very different than what you got from the first two beers. Those beers come from Europe. And so they use European hops. And so for the Pilsner Urquell, they use Satz hops. For the Franziskaner, they probably used Hallertauer. Anyway, German hops, which are floral and very lovely. They're lovely. What we get in this pale ale is a very assertive hop that is definitely at the forefront. You know, this is the when they made this beer at Sierra Nevada years ago, at the very beginning of the craft beer revolution, there weren't a lot of hops available. There weren't hop yards all over the country. And so they used what they had, and it was Centennial hops. Centennial. Is it Centennial or is it Cascade? It's one of those sea hops.
Cascade.
Thank you. Cascade. And they're pretty similar. They give a very piney note. So and Sierra Nevada uses American grown barley. So this is definitely it's very different than our previous beers. And so it has an assertive quality. The hops are American, the malt is American, and the yeast is a special strain called Chico strain, because that's where Sierra Nevada started. It was in Chico, California. And they had an ale strain, and I don't remember where Ken Grossman, who was the originator, where he found it from, but he kind of developed it in his brewery, and it kind of adapted to the brewery. And so it gives a very clean, you don't get a lot of character from the yeast. Like we did in the last beer, you got a lot of yeast character. This, not so much yeast character. What you get is the punch from the hops. So what is it that you guys are getting? Did we see? Oh yeah, we saw a brief word cloud there. Okay, so.
Oh, we had the word cloud up for a long time, actually.
I know.
So
I get excited. I get excited because I love this stuff.
Since you were talking about the hops, I thought we'd move on to your mini lecture on the terroir of hops.
Yes. So I'm going to do this really briefly because I don't want everyone to get bored. So the terroir of hops. Hops.
We're not going to get bored.
That's right. Quick drink. Hops grow in certain parts of the world. In a swath, which I have a map that's coming up, but they grow up these vines, and the hops are green flowers that hang off the vine. You can click enter again, Rebecca. So they grow up long ropes, and they'll grow all the way up like 20 or 30, 40 feet up. No, I don't know, really high. They have to use special machines to harvest them, and they just cut the whole vine stem off, which is called a bine. And there's a close-up of Cascade hops from Colorado, and they're really cool. They're two-tone. They're these overlapping green on green flowers. They're amazing, and they're super fragrant and lovely. Kate, hit it again, Rebecca. And they're separated from the vines, and the strands of the vine are called bines. And then they're dried, and then they kind of shrink a little, and they get crispy. They look like parchment paper, but they keep their greenness. And in some places they'll use them fresh, but you have to use them, if you're going to use them fresh, you have to kind of use them like within a day. But mostly they dry them very gently so that they don't lose any of the volatiles, and then they press them into bales, or they pulverize them and turn them into little pellets. Okay, let's look at the next one. All right, so if you cut one of these guys in a cross section, because that's what we like as geologists, you get to see that on the inside of this green on green flower, you have all these little yellow bits, and those are called lupulin glands. And they're sticky globs of essential oils and resins. And that's where we get these wonderful aromas and the bittering compounds. And those are so essential to really round the beer out. Because if we had a beer that didn't have hops, it would be a Malta, which is, if you've ever had a Malta, is so sweet, it makes your teeth hurt. So the bitterness helps balance the sweetness of the malt, and it just makes it really good, right? And so it provides antimicrobial properties that help preserve the beer. And that's the beauty of it. It's like back in the old days, water wasn't necessarily good. And by boiling the water in order to do the brew, and then adding hops, which provided a long-term antimicrobial component, you could make you could make a beverage that was healthy and didn't go bad after a while. And you could put it in casks. And if you put extra dry hops in there, those casks would make it all the way across the ocean from England to India. And that's where the term India Pale Ale came from, is the pale ale that they dry hopped and they put it in the casks, and it made it all the way to India. And the folks that encountered that beer found it to be wonderful and delicious, and that became one of the classic styles. Now you can get along without hops, although it's kind of a sad thing. You can make this thing called Brew It, which is a collection of various herbs. It's just never as good, but people do it. And I've seen little breweries around here selling Brew It beer, and they're never very good. Hops are better.
Ed, did you have something to add?
Yeah, there's actually an interesting story in the story that Janine was just telling about how the public became aware of this. So what was happening is the English were working in India. They were taking over India, and what had happened is the ships, when they went there, were, by the time the beer got there, it was spoiling. So the brewers had to do something. They had to figure out some other way of doing it, because they didn't know about pasteurization. That hadn't happened yet. And that they didn't really realize what the main issue was. They knew that hops was a preservative, so they just threw in a whole bunch more and were like, all right, let's try it again. And it ended up, it worked. But the people didn't hear about it until a ship foundered in the London harbor. And the contents, the barrels from that ship, just got auctioned off. So the local pubs in London were like, yeah, it's cheap beer. We'll buy it and sell it. And it turned out people loved it. So it wasn't just the military people who got their hands on it. Instead, the locals were able to enjoy it because of some ship that went down in the harbor or got stuck.
That's awesome. I never heard that story. That's fantastic. Yeah. So, when you drink this, the first thing that happens to me when I drink I gotta tell you a real quick story. I was in southern Mexico on a long-term job. I was going there for like a week or two at a time, and then I'd come home for a week and then go back down there. It was a geology job. And in Mexico, they have some good beers, but they like their beers sweet. And I needed a hop fix. So my friends took me to a local craft beer bar, and they're like, oh, look, here's our beer menu. And I looked through the beer menu and I saw Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And I'm like, oh, please, one of these. Like, 2 reasons I ordered it that way. Okay. I ordered it because, well, mainly one. Okay. They dry hop this. So it's got lots of fresh hop flavor and preservative qualities in it. That's the one part. The other part is they add a little tiny bit of yeast in the bottle so that it bottle conditions, and that keeps it from becoming oxidized and stale. So I get this beer and the waitress brings it to me. She says, "Aquí está su pale ale." Pale ale. This is the pale ale. Can you read it? I'll never forget that. And it was the best beer I ever had. I loved it. It definitely hit the spot. So
Janine, I have that exact same story. I mean, not the origin, but like amongst all my friends, we've always called Sierra Nevada Pale Ale Pale Ale. Everything else is another kind of pale ale. That's fine. But if you ask for a Pale Ale, It's a Sierra Nevada one.
It's beautiful because it's Sierra Nevada, and and you can get it in Mexico, even the farthest reaches of Mexico, you can get it, and it's always good. So, all right, so the hops are added to beers. For this beer, I know this, that because I visited the brewery, I got the Beer Geek tour. They add it at the beginning of the boil, the middle of the boil. At the end of the boil, they'll throw more hops in. And then they'll dry hop it. They'll put it in the fermenter. Oh yeah, in the whirlpool. After the boil and before the fermenter, in the whirlpool at a slightly lower temperature, like about 180 to 160. They'll start throwing hops in. And then they'll dry hop it in the fermenter. Sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes they're ridiculous and they do it 3 times. They use a lot of hops. And in some places, they'll run your beer through a Randall filled with fresh hops before they pour it into your glass. So for most beers, it's some hops at the beginning, maybe some hops in the middle, maybe a little bit of hops at the end for aroma. Or like for the stout, just hops at the beginning and that's it, because the stout is not about the hops. But for an IPA, the more the better. So is there one after this? You're pushing me forward on this one. There we go. So the hops, they are grown in a range, right? They need a very specific climate range. So the biggest hop fields are in Europe and the UK and the Pacific Northwest. But there's also massive ones in upper Midwest. There's some in China, although I think those are going away these days. Hops are in Japan. And then in Southern Hemisphere, you can see where they are. And New Zealand and Australia are turning out some amazing new varieties. So as climate changes, these ranges for the hop fields may migrate north and south, respectively, which is interesting, I think. Yeah, and they depend a lot on the soil too, because the hops like a lot of water, but they can't dry out too fast, and yet they can't sit in a puddle either. So it needs to be well-drained soil. And so also there are varieties of hops. If you grow the same variety in different places, you'll get different results based on the local conditions. And that's caused by local stressors, bugs, drought, also the nature of the soil. And there's also genetic factors that new hops are being created all the time through genetic manipulation, and which is great, overwhelming. As a brewer, it's like, okay, this year we have 20 new hop varieties. And I'm like, now what do I have to change all my recipes? So the noble hops are never supposed to change. So here's an example of, real quick, one hop farm in Yakima Valley. And they had, in one farm, they have 3 different types of soil, and the soil varies that, well, the right two don't vary that much. But the alluvial farm soil is much more sand. And then the others, much more silt. And the sand had, the alluvial farm soil has a lot more volcanic component, because it's Yakima Valley in the, in the Cascade, near the Cascades. So that does influence what the same variety of hop, the same strain of hop tastes different from those different fields. So how do you sample this? How do you test this? Well, you make these things called spider web charts, and these can be, you can put any kind of thing on these charts that you want. In this case, we're doing the different types of common hop flavors at each of these different points. I don't know how many, 12 points, I guess. And so menthol, tea, green fruits, etc. You can read them. And then what you can't what I can't see on the bottom is part of this is, let me see if I can get it. Oh, well, the yellow is from, well, you can't see. It's from, I think it's from cool hopping, and then the darker color is from warm hopping, and then the orange is the overlap. So what you get, depending on the temperature at which you add the hops, you can get a very different flavor profile from the same hop. Now, these are all cascades, and we can go through them really fast. Just watch. Okay, you can click to the next one, and click to the next one, and click. Yeah. So Australian, yeah, and they're all cascades, and they all give different. Look how different they are, depending on what temperature you add it and where it grew. So it's very interesting. And so brewers need to adapt their recipes to the types of hops that they're getting, because it's so important in their critical recipes, which are the IPAs. So in this beer, I think you get resinous piney, very, very much, but you also get some really nice citrus. You don't get tropical fruit. You don't get cedar. You don't get tobacco or herbal. In this one, you get resinous, piney, and citrus, right? What do you guys get?
Yeah, I think you might get a little bit grassy there too, maybe.
Yeah. Grassy, like fresh mown lawn, kind of. Yeah. It's just, so I drink a beer like this and I immediately get a big old smile on my face.
Me too.
Happy, hoppy, happy.
Hey, so Adam, you had a couple things you were going to share, but I think some of these things have already been touched upon.
Yeah, I think Janine and Ed both stole my stories, so that's all right.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. I will just add, as a personal aside, I've got a wonderful little hop plant right outside my window here that my wife got me that I really enjoy growing hops at the house. So it's fun. Even in Houston, you can grow them.
Oh, mine died.
Oh no.
Yeah,
mine froze in the Great Freeze, and then it came back roaring this spring. So
well, I'm impressed it came back.
Yeah.
They're hardy. They're definitely hardy plants.
All right, so we, not surprisingly, are running behind. I'm still impressed by how not behind we are. I want to take a moment to let everybody in the room know, including panelists, that if you would like a bio break, that is totally acceptable. If we could maybe, I've had some requests on the side for working that in. And so at this point, if Kat's okay with it, we can take 1 to 2 questions. And panelists, if you don't mind, maybe if you want a bio break, maybe staggering it. just letting you all know that is allowed. But yeah, go ahead, go for it, Kat.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to ask one about cans versus bottles, which is a very controversial subject. But yeah, I'll kick it to Adam. I see you nodding heavily, so I'm going to start with you. Any recommendations, can versus bottles?
I mean, it depends on the question you're asking, but cans are a better container for most everything, right? The evils for beer are light and oxygen. You know, that's the packaging evils. And the cans totally cut out any type of light that come into it. So that's, number one, that's perfect. And brown bottles, they work all right for that too. But then oxygen, you actually have a better job of removing all the oxygen from the packaging line if you're canning instead of bottling as well. The big downside, of course, is nobody wants to drink out of a can, right? You want to drink out of a bottle. But the caveat is you shouldn't be drinking out of either. You should be drinking out of a nice tulip glass and enjoying it wonderfully. So that's my very impassioned 5 cents.
Cool. All right. Can I, Ed or Janine, do you have any comments on cans versus bottles?
Yeah, so exactly what Adam said. I have nothing to add. He's exactly right.
I'll add a little bit. The idea
Yeah, sure.
in the can, the other added benefit of the can is there's less headspace, which means there's less oxygen. So one of the things that makes Sierra Nevada so wonderfully fresh every time we open one of them is they have a little bit of yeast in the bottle, which the yeast will eat that. Well, they use the oxygen to respire, and therefore, while they're alive in there, they're getting rid of the oxygen. The can sort of short circuits all of that. There's just less oxygen in there.
Right.
Of course, the other option is just, pick up a kegerator and then, it's a draft beer whenever you want it.
There you go.
Exactly. I'm looking forward to more growlers after when things get a little bit more normal. I really enjoy getting growlers filled, and the timeline, you have to drink them. They're going to go bad. So
Yeah, there's no other
yeah.
option. You can only drink it or throw it away. Who wants to do that?
Exactly. What are you going to do? So, so I was very, as someone who works in petroleum geology, I am very drawn to this question, but I don't know if it's just me. But they asked about thermal maturity, vitrinite reflectance of dried hops. I don't know if we can comment on that, but I thought it was a great question. So
It's very, that's pretty cool.
it's a really cool question.
Thought about that. Anyone? Ed? Adam?
There's certainly maturity factors with hops, right? They don't have a long shelf life, but I don't know that you could
They're never heated.
get to the vitrinite reflectance of them.
Right. They're never heated past 212. So I don't think you'd get to the vitrinite reflectance unless you
I would be really interested to see.
Bury 'em in-
Yeah, if we got any geochemists out there.
there.
Anyone who wants to let us use their labs for that.
I noticed one other question that was sort of related to the can and
Sure,
bottle
Ed, yeah.
came up, and that was related to the color of the bottle and why sometimes green bottles are skunky. And that is totally true. There is a skunky character, and it has to do with the yeast, or sorry, with the hops. And there are certain, through a green bottle, you can actually isomerize the hop in there and then create this really odd skunky flavor. And it doesn't take long. If you want to test this sometime, take a beer that's not Miller, because Miller has somehow engineered their hops to not do this.
better living through chemistry.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. But if you take any other beer other than a Miller and you take it outside, particularly an ale, you let it sit in the sun for a few minutes in in a glass, in a pint glass, it will start to turn skunky really fast. You've probably noticed that if you have beers outside or at a patio or something like that. Brown bottles will diminish that. It'll still happen with a brown bottle, but it takes a lot longer time. And you completely eliminate that as an issue for beer flavor with a keg or with a can.
So Ed, we used to do that at the brewery I worked at, and it was amazing how fast it went. Where you pour a draft, you try it inside the tap room, you walk outside, you just hold it in the sun for 10 seconds, 30 seconds, you try it again. It's a different animal altogether.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really neat how fast it goes.
Yep.
I love all this discussion, guys, because I think my perspective on this prior to this discussion was, speaking as a geologist doing field work, was if you're going camping or doing field work, you bring cans because you can crush them and bring them home, whereas you don't want to lug around heavy bottles. So that was my, binary choice option, but it's great to hear all the other science behind it.
Well, also, we don't want glass in nature because we don't want it to break and shatter everywhere.
There's that.
Yes.
You
So
guys, you got to think about volume. You take the wine, you put the wine in the camelback, and then you carry the camelback with you. It's rosé all day.
we really need to have a wine versus we need a wine versus beer event.
We need to have a face-off.
I've done that. Yeah, I've done that.
Okay, Rebecca, any more questions or back to you?
I think we're going to move on because
Okay,
we've got
perfect.
one more beer, and I'm interpreting that all of us are really enjoying the beer, and maybe a little bit. So let's go ahead and move on, because I want to make sure we get to this beer, which I am one of those people that before today's event, I would say I don't like stouts, and I'm not a Guinness fan, and I'm hoping that Adam and comments from Ed and Janine can change my mind. All right, So Adam, can you start by telling us how exactly, some of us, I got the fancy can that you told us to get, and I don't drink Guinness, so there's something in my can, I can hear it. And
Exactly.
I don't know what's going on. Can you tell me what to do? How do we do this?
For those of us that followed the suggestions and got the tall boy Guinness with the thing that's shaking around inside of it, that thing is actually a nitrogenator. And so as soon as you pop the top, it releases the pressure and allows that nitrogenator to explode, and it releases a large volume of nitrogen into the beer itself. Now,
that was so loud. Sorry, that scared
right.
me. That was loud.
Nitrogen is super interesting because it's not soluble the way that carbon dioxide is. So you think about all these different gases and you think, why don't they just all go into the beer and affect the mouthfeel in the same way? But the reason that you have to have this little ball in there is the CO2 you pump into the liquid and actually becomes solubilized, becomes carbonic acid, and is released naturally when you release that pressure. The nitrogen, if you pump it into any liquid, it's going to immediately just come right back out again. So it has to be that kind of at the source type thing. So if you ever order a Guinness at a bar, it comes from a fancy tap, and that's so that they can push it with nitrogen and have the same effect. Now, we've been talking a lot about nitrogen, but the reason that it's there to begin with is because it creates these very tiny, fine bubbles to give you a really interesting mouthfeel. So I'm doing a terrible job of pouring this beer, but that's
I was
kind
going
of.
to say, Adam, how do we? So I used to be a bartender, and
Yeah.
at an Irish pub, and my customers would get angry if there was any head with a Guinness. Were they correct? You don't want any head with a Guinness, or were they just sort of like following some sort of myth? Tell me how much head we should have.
Just like I've been saying, the nitrogen comes out of solution very quickly, right? And so if it sits for more than a couple of minutes, you're not going to see the same head that you would in say, our Hefeweizen, that has much higher CO2 levels than your Guinness does. And actually, at bars, if you ever get challenged to a chugging contest, choose Guinness because it goes down so much quicker because it's not carbonated, even though it's dark. Just promise. But so anyway.
Well, we had a lot of those at my Irish pub in New Jersey. Lots of Guinness chugging.
I'm sure, yeah. So I'd stop short of 0 head, but I would, this is going to be on the lighter end. And what's neat is when you first pour that, you actually see the bubbles going down the outside of the glass. And people always get excited. Why are bubbles going down? They're not actually just going down. It forms this kind of vacuum where it comes up from the center, and so it drags it down the edges of your glass and looks really neat before it. Yeah, so let's go ahead and go to the word cloud and see what people are saying as they start to drink this.
Great comments.
Stefano, are you there? Okay, you are. Wasn't sure if you were on a bio break.
Sorry, it's coming. No. I was just getting it ready.
So it's probably not surprising. We've talked around this a little bit, but the beers that we've chosen emphasize different things. And this stout from Guinness is really meant to emphasize the malt character that you get out of a beer. So a lot of the words I'm seeing show up there are malty. Bitter is really interesting, and Ed's going to talk about that at the end. I'm not going to steal your story, Ed. Don't worry.
I like the smoke and the burnt toast in there. Although we had an early entry that has diminished in size, but there was a yuck in there as well. So
yeah. I mean, stouts are definitely it's some
I
people
like
love
the leprechauns. Leprechauns is in there. Roasted marshmallow.
Yeah, marshmallow. The sweetness is really what comes through, and that's an effect of that malt character that Ed had talked about at the beginning. Some of these chains of sugars we pull out of the malt. Some of these are fermentable, and some of these are not. And so, in a lot of darker beers, you have a more complex profile of the sugar chains, and so you end up with more that are not fermentable. And so, rather than being converted into alcohol and CO2, they remain in the final product, and you end up with a slightly sweeter product in the end.
What's
All right, I
interesting?
have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't been asking many questions. I'm gonna take the fact that I can turn my mic on and ask a question. So I'm not a big stout drinker, and so I don't really drink Guinness often. It tastes a little on the, I don't know the right term, on the watery side. It doesn't feel very full bodied to me.
Yeah.
Is that
That's,
typical, or is that something wrong with my particular can? You know, I'm just
no,
wondering.
it is interesting. So Guinness is one of the lighter stouts on the market, right? If you look at both alcohol and calories, honestly, Guinness is it's a very light beer. It just happens to have a lot of malt character in it. And so that plus the low CO2 count ends up with it can be watery, especially after coming off of some like the very hoppy pale ale that we just had. And I saw you were going to say
That's a really good
something.
point, Adam, because I've heard a lot of people talking about, oh, I don't like strong beers like stout. And to me, that's one of the, I mean, Guinness is one of the mildest beers out there. It's dark, but that doesn't, I mean, that a lot of people associate because of the, you know, the Rasputins and these really strong
Sure.
imperial stouts and stuff. But
Yeah, but they're right. Don't be afraid of the dark. It's just like tea. Your tea can be very black or dark brown, and it's watery and light. It's just the color, and that's something that a new beer drinker needs to kind of get over. It's a hurdle.
Yeah, one of the things that is interesting, it does tend to be a little bit thin, and it's thin.
This beer, yeah.
It's literally a little bit lighter.
Yeah.
There are fewer dissolved solids in it, so a fluid ounce of it is going to weigh less than a fluid ounce, probably, of that Sierra Nevada, which, you know, is kind of interesting. So it seems a little bit lighter on your tongue. When we brew a beer like this, it is not that we are brewing it with all these dark grains. They're really dark grains. So when we're malting barley, it can be malted in hundreds of different characteristics. It can be at high temperature for a long period of time, or at a low temperature for a long period of time. And it creates different types of malts. For a beer like the stout, it might have about 20% or less of the grain bill that's actually from these really dark grains. The dark grains, like coffee, have a somewhat of a bitter character to them. I kind of get a dark chocolate sort of flavor, like a bitter chocolate flavor out of this. And what's interesting is if we go back to tasting it like we kind of learned in the beginning, where we saturate our tongue, make sure it gets all over our mouth, you start to get a little bit of the bitter character on the roof of your mouth. And it's a bitter character that is very similar to coffee. And it's a character that's actually coming from the grain and not from the hops. So it's an interesting sort of bitter. It is a bitter sensation that I'm getting on the roof of my mouth. And it's part of these dark grains that are roasted in ways very similar to the ways that coffee is roasted. But yet it only represents a small portion of the grain bill for this grain. Still, most of it is the pale ale malts that can create the sugars that are necessary for the whole fermentation process to take place.
Yeah, that's a neat point I have to mention as well, is that once you kiln a malt, I've got an image for that in a second, but once you kiln a malt to a certain temperature, you're actually removing a lot of that sugar content. And so you end up with something with less fermentable sugar and more of this kind of complex bitterness that you were mentioning. Yeah.
Adam, that's why I went back to these slides, because I thought that was a good segue into your slides.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So if you jump to the next slide, this is just a copy of the water slide that I kind of ended the Pilsner talk with. And again, in these historical breweries, you know, people were trying to maximize what they have, right? And so in Dublin, where Guinness is from, they had this harder water, so more dissolved ions in that water, more alkalinity, more of a buffer. And so they needed to balance that out with a little bit of acidity in order to reach those optimum pH for your mash tun. And then there's, 4 main ingredients here. We've got water, yeast, hops, barley. And so if you're going to balance out the pH, what you had to do was put in some more of this roasted barley, and that's got some organic acids that come with it from the malting process. And so that's really the origin of these classic dark beers that we love so much now. So go ahead and jump to the next slide. So this is just a quick overview, cartoony style of the malting process. So it starts with steeping, which you're just basically raising the moisture content. And then it goes to germinating, where you're essentially trying to trick this barley grain into thinking that it's been planted and it's about to grow. So it's kind of a vicious process, because you trick it into thinking it's going to grow. It starts to put out its little roots. And in doing so, it breaks down some of the cell walls that give you some really terrible flavors if you try to ferment it. This is where those enzymes come into play. It starts producing those enzymes that Ed had talked about. And right when it thinks it's about to, be planted and form a husk, then you stick it in the oven and you kill it. And that kilning process is really where the creativity comes into play. And this is where you can change those parameters and create these different types of grain, or these different types of malt that give very different flavors to your final beer. And so to talk that through, the next slide, Rebecca, these are just 4 different base malts. And we talked about that briefly, where your base malt is where most of your fermentable sugars come from. Some of your largest flavors come from these kind of specialty adjuncts that you've had at the end, with the very roasted malt that gives Guinness its black color. But these are just 4 your base malts that give it the sugar and a lot of mouthfeel and flavor as well. So on the left there, you have kind of a representative color, the styles that they're used for. SRM, which is actually standard research method, but all it is a way of classifying that the colors of final beers will be based off of these base malts, and then kind of the process that leads to it. And again, you can tweak tons of little variables as you go through this to give it very specific flavors that you're going for. That's kind of a fun aside, actually. My dad was working in a place one time where alcohol was forbidden, and so it wasn't possible to get a beer, but they also make it really tough to get beer ingredients. And so he actually went to the market and got bushels of grain and took it back to his apartment, and went through this whole process in his apartment, where he had cookie sheets of grain germinating underneath his bed, and then he would kiln it in his oven and make beer out of it. It's really cool. He's the only home brewer I've ever known that actually went through the whole malting process himself. But as you can imagine, kilning grain and brewing beer, if you ever walk into a brewery, it's quite aromatic. It's not subtle. So it's not the best thing to do in an apartment when alcohol is forbidden. And so you get chased out of town eventually. But yeah, all for the name of beer. So that's it for this slide.
Cheers.
What a fun story. Wow.
Yep, this one.
All right.
Unmute. Was it Saudi Arabia where your dad was stationed?
There might still be arrest warrants out, so I'm not gonna.
Oh, okay, all right, somewhere over there, yeah. So the local homebrew store here in Houston, it's gone now, unfortunately. DeFalco's used to regularly send care packages to that part of the world to their customers who needed to make their own beer.
There you go. There you go.
That's a geology thing. Yep. I'm trying to answer questions here while we're going.
Did Ed want to add anything?
We kind of covered that bitterness.
Yeah, okay.
So I think we covered stouts.
Good. Then Kat, how about you feed us some of the
man,
more common questions? I know there's
so many
a lot.
great questions. There's so many great questions.
Well,
So
I
you
will
may have
just
already.
quickly, let me just quickly say this luckily bleeds directly into the Q&A portion, right? Yeah, so, all right, so let's just go ahead and take a couple questions.
Yeah, I'll just shoot one, and I think you guys may have touched on this already, but it doesn't hurt to re-ask it. What is the difference between a stout and an extra stout? And I know I've seen this with Guinness, but yeah, do you want to comment on that again? Is that the, yeah?
I was just noticing that the 6-pack I got is the extra stout, ABV, alcohol by volume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you can have the regular Guinness is, I think, like 3.5% ABV. Adam, am I right?
Oh, I don't know that off the top of my head. I'm
Look at your
sorry.
can. So you got your can, right?
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Drinking beer.
I saw in the chat 4.3, so let's go with it. I don't see it on my
Oh, yeah.
phone.
All right, 4.3.
Okay,
All
well,
right.
while you're
So
looking,
this extra stout is 5.6% ABV, which means they used more malt to get more sugar
Yeah.
to create a higher original gravity. We're talking specific gravity. That's your starting specific gravity. We all know what that is. And then your yeast chaws it up. And then when you're done, when your yeast poops out and it falls down and everything gets finished, then you measure your specific gravity again, which is your final gravity. And you take the difference between the two, you multiply it by a number. You don't need to know that. That's too much information. And then you get your ABV.
okay.
I think in the case of stout, or in the case of Guinness, stout and extra stout is more of a marketing thing, right, guys? I don't think it's
Yeah, I got a brother-in-law that
'Cause
works at
this
Guinness,
is higher
so,
ABV, so it's a
Yeah.
higher ABV.
right, but it's
Oh,
not
you
like an
see-
official
yeah.
determined, category or something like that.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
a branding thing, I should say.
It's a branding thing, right? And then there's also Imperial Stout, which
Mhm,
is
mhm,
Which is a really, that's
a lot more grain that gets used
mhm.
and a much
Well-
higher ABV.
Well, I'll throw a nice question here to Ed that just came up. Is it true that the Egyptians who helped build the pyramids were given 2 beers a day for sustenance? I think it was more than that, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, they were paid in bread and beer. Not all of the pyramid builders were slaves. Most of them were not. So yeah, they would have received more than a couple of beers. Those beers also would have been a lot lower in alcohol than what we're typically thinking about today. So it also helped purify the water back then. So small amounts of beer would have been put into the water to make sure it was safe to drink.
goes back to our thing about no known pathogens in beer. It helps actually make things safe. And it was prescribed to pregnant ladies in Ireland, right? Have your beer to make sure that you can be rationed a good, safe drinking source.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun story. The Mayflower came ashore early because they ran out of beer. They still had lots of kegs of water, but they ran out of beer, so they couldn't even drink the water they brought because it wasn't safe over a period of time. When the Arabella came to America on the next round, they brought 3 times as much beer on their ship to make sure that didn't happen again.
Was it IPA? Did they learn from their mistakes?
I don't think it was. I think that was before IPA became an IPA, but I don't know the answer.
So interesting. I mean, there's so much great folk history and lore and good anecdotes tied to beer. Yeah, beer makes everything work.
That's true. Do we have time for another question, Rebecca, or are we good?
You know what? If you guys don't mind, I'd like to move on to end our last poll. There's so many good questions. I almost was like, yeah, I'm reading some from the chat. Let's answer them. But Stefano, are you ready to show us the map? Because I am fascinated to see it. Oh, well, oh no, sorry.
Yeah,
We've got the other poll.
Yeah, we've got to do the last poll first. So
Yes.
please go back to Menti and give us your beer ratings after having tasted everything. And what you see on the right here is the live poll results as they're coming in. On the left, this is a screenshot of the the previous question that you answered before tasting. So it's interesting to see some of the changes. I'm kind of with you there on the Pilsner. So I wasn't able to find Pilsner Urquell because I left the decision till the shopping till last minute. So I ended up getting 3 or 4 different Pilsners, and my Pilsner preference has gone up, although that's been in 1 or 2 of those that I've purchased. So I found quite a bit of variety within that same genre.
This is beer appreciation. All the scores went up.
All the scores went up, and I think
Well,
Pale
not
ale.
the pale ale.
another thing that, well, true. Another thing that I've realized though is that we've normalized everything, so everybody likes everything the same.
Yep.
Yeah. Slight increases. Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel
so
like the
that's great.
skew for the pale ale has increased, even if the average has. I'm assuming this is a mean that we're seeing, not a median.
I don't know if it's a geometric average or
I'm
or
personally more of a
arithmetic or
median person.
harmonic or I don't
Median
think Menti knows
harmonic.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry. Hey, if we're gonna start talking statistics,
That's right. Yeah, this is not
statistics and
statistically
modeling,
valid.
I'm all in.
The good thing is everything, like Ed pointed out, has mostly gone up. So we can make that as a first level
Yeah, that's
characterization. So one thing that Rebecca alluded to is in the earlier poll that you all had responded to with our geographic distribution.
Uh-huh.
I was able to pull out all this data from, I guess I did this when we had about 370. So there's a few more that won't be captured in here, but let me show you the results here. Let me go into presentation mode so it's nice and big. And hopefully it'll go to the right screen. Yes, good. So here are our results. So we've got a really awesome representation of 46 states, including the District of Columbia. So we got only 5 states missing. That's not too bad. 90% participation.
All right.
Got a strong showing from Texas and California and Colorado, and diminishing from there. And then I really like the international component. You know, we have obviously a strong US showing, but 18 unique countries listed. So let's go through and look at how this looks geographically. So a lot of people in Houston. So, you know, I apologize. I did this for domestic versus international, and Texas is only going to count as a state. It's not its own republic. It's only counted in the domestic ones. Although some people in Texas might want that put on the global map. But anyways, yeah, so Texas and California have quite a lot of people. And you can see the rest, obviously, big beer drinking state in Colorado and geology state, and good showing from the Northeast as well. And pretty good coverage all throughout. So
we got more than 90% of the states, Stefan. That's
yeah,
a good thing.
Can't beat that. So then here are global distribution, obviously lots in the US, but quite a fair representation from almost every continent, including New Zealand here. The number didn't show up, but New Zealand's in there. So nobody from McMurdo called in, unfortunately. So we don't have Antarctica in there, but
I saw someone just wrote, I'm here, I'm from the Philippines. I didn't fill it out. So
okay, cool.
That's another good one to throw in there.
That's another data point here in Southeast Asia. So that's great.
Everyone in Asia, you've got so much respect for me right now for joining in at your hour. Thank you.
I should have overlain the time zones on here, because like our Thai friend pointed out, it's 4 a.m. for them there. So pretty impressive.
England. No one from the Netherlands. Oh.
Yeah, and I need to get on my Italian.
I'm surprised.
But we've got somebody in the UK, so that's good.
Yeah.
Pat, you're muted. I see you talking, just so you know.
I'm just mumbling to myself here about where everyone's calling in from, pointing at the map. So great.
The person, families in the Philippines, but they're actually in Kentucky. Okay.
And we don't have anyone from the Czech Republic or Ireland, so maybe we need to do a little more marketing with the Brewers there for our next round. But
Could have been
Yeah.
a learning experience for them. They could have understood their water sources better.
It's true.
Well, this was really cool. Hey, big kudos to Stefano for managing to manage the Menti poll throughout this entire event while making this map. That was impressive. Good job.
Cheers.
Everybody,
Yeah,
cheers.
cheers to that. Thank you. At this point, I think we might want to, do we want to transition to our happy hour? I think we might. All right.
So, okay.
I have one quick question that I wanted to steal the opportunity to ask, since we were talking earlier about the nitrogenated cans and such. What are our panelists' thoughts on? I've had some amazing beers in little breweries where they'll rotate some beer on their nitro tap, and 90% of the time it's a stout or a porter. But some of my best beers I've ever had were like pale ales on nitro, or like Hefeweizens on nitro, and it gives you that like mini bubbles feel and that smoothness, and it's incredible. But you can't buy it. I've never seen one bottled that way, but anyways,
it's super fun. I usually try and keep a tank of you have to have a nitrogen mix. It has to be nitrogen and CO2 to be able to press that through, because you still need the CO2 to keep the CO2 in solution, and so you just add nitrogen on top of that and crank up the pressure a little bit. But I like to keep a tank of that on my kegerator whenever I can, because it's neat to throw anything on it, because you do get that little micro bubble mouthfeel, and it's fun. I love nitrogenated blondes. That's some of my favorite beer, because it's just a very interesting drinking experience. Absolutely.
The one of the big things, Stefano, my bet is that you're a fan of malt. Part of the reason that you get a different character is that nitrogen has almost no flavor. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is strongly acrid. So what tends to happen in any beer that is pushed with nitrogen is, or inherent in that beer is nitrogen instead of CO2, is an enhancement of some of the raw flavors that are a part of that beer. And in particular, malt seems to get accentuated. So when you do have a nitrogenated beer versus a carbonated beer, it brings out more of the malt character and the raw character of the beer, and eliminates the acrid flavor of CO2.
I actually am not a fan of nitrogen in most beer. It smooths it and takes the edge off. I kind of like the acrid edge that CO2 gives. And then you get a nitro beer, only in stouts, when like creamy, kind of sweet stouts, then I like it. But anything that's hoppy, nope. Personal preference.
No, it's super interesting. And so, yeah, I like the CO2 component as well. And that's why I usually turn the pressure up probably too high, so that you keep that CO2 in solution. And so you get that a little bit, but then you also get the smoothness of the small bubbles. It's personal preference.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I haven't, I've never had the mixing system. You got to have your gas mix system going so that you can control that.
Yeah.
So I want, before we transition, I'm seeing some side on our side organizer chat here. I think there's a really good question that we should address, because I see that Carla wanted to address it, Kat wanted to address it, and I wanted to address it before too. Go ahead, Kat. What is this question?
Well, is it the very provocative question? Simple, so simple, it's philosophical. All right, I'll go ahead and ask it. Why is a beer called a beer? Any comments, panelists?
Oh my God, in so many languages, it's
so
called
simple.
beer. It's an ancient thing.
And no one knows why.
Let's know about this. Why is a beer called a beer?
Anyone know in the chat? Does anyone know
Gosh, wait for the chat to blow up here.
Yeah, chat. We need some people to answer us here.
I did see.
Someone
not
says
trying to
it's
drag us back, but
Old word for barley?
Someone says that.
not trying to drag us back to the previous question, but I did see a chat pop up about Conductor from Steamworks, and that is one of my favorite beers, and that can be nitrogenated as well. So that's
So according to the etymology dictionary,
Thank you, Ed.
sorry guys, it's based on Latin, and it's a monastic word for drink. So apparently it's the original drink. No, I'm kidding, but it comes from drink as a verb, to drink.
To drink.
To drink.
Or as a noun, a drink. It's both. To drink and a drink, both Latin. Latin for biber, a drink, or bibere, to drink.
I like it.
Right, and so many of the European languages have a lot of Latin mixed in with them, so they picked that up too. Yeah,
Like that.
We're,
All right.
we're
That
getting
was-
into the drunk history part of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're right, Ed. In Italian, bere means to drink, which is B-E-R-E. So you just got to shuffle some letters around and you get beer.
So I really enjoy drunk history, and every time I'm at EGU or really any conference, we're always like, when are we going to film a drunk geology? When is this happening?
We just did. We just did.
We just need some
So
sea level actors.
there's a story I heard. You guys can tell me if I'm wrong, okay? I heard the story that the whole idea of décollements, right, which is the floating top sheet of a huge thrust mass, came about because some drunk geologists were sitting around the campfire and they were putting their cans down on some log or platform or table near the fire. And so the bottom of the flat surface that they were putting their beer cans on was kind of warm. They put their beer cans down and the can on its own started to slide across the surface. And they were looking at this can moving on its own. It was like, oh, water pressure makes the top slab move. And that's how they figured out how décollements worked. I don't know. That's what I was told a long time ago in the field while drinking beer.
Beer affects geology.
Aha!
Let's
There you go,
perpetuate
Ed.
this.
I was wondering how you're going to work that in. That works. I like it.
All right, guys. So we've got some people already asking about how to get to the Wonder Room. So I think people are excited to, we didn't want to keep our audience quiet, guys. It was just so many of you all that we had to keep you all muted, but I want to hear what y'all have to say. So let's go over to the Wonder Room where everyone can talk. So here is the, can people just continuously drop the Wonder link in the chat so people keep seeing it? But this is what a Wonder Room looks like if you've never been there before. When you go, you might have to sign out of Zoom in order to log in, because sometimes the Wonder Room requires that only one app is using your microphone and camera at a time. So just giving you that heads up. When you get there, it'll ask you to make your name. You'll take a picture and you have a little avatar that you're gonna like drag around this room that you're looking at in map view. So we have this example here. So you're gonna take your mouse, you see this little circle in the Igneous is Bliss box. So there's boxes in the room for topics if you want to go there. Once you drag your avatar near another avatar, so another little circle with a picture in it, your cameras will pop up and you can start talking. And so you'll be in what's called a circle. And so as you drag your bubble near other people, you'll start like a little chat circle. And so it's a really fun way and interactive way to mimic being at a conference. Are there any questions about the Wonder Room or anything I left out, Kat?
No, I don't think so. I think just go to the link and like right on the screen right now, there'll be a little box. And like you just said, Rebecca, just follow the steps to hook your mic and your camera up and you'll just pop right in and you'll be there and you can just move around with your mouse. It's pretty straightforward and yeah, just have fun with it.
And if you hover your mouse over bubbles, I think you can see the name of the person. So if you want to find your friends,
Yeah.
It's just like in a conference room at EGU, you have to look, right? You're like, okay, I know my friends should be near the beer, or I know they're in EPSP. If you're in my group, Earth and Planetary Surface Processes, it's going to be the same. You're going to have to look for your friends.
Yeah.
So just like hover around and meet new folks. And
Yeah, enjoy
all
it.
right. Yep. And so I'll leave this here. Thank you, Ed, for this slide. We love this slide. Cheers in many languages. And we will leave this slide up in this room in case you're, of the 200 people left, maybe half of you are actually in the bathroom right now, and you'll come back and wonder where we all went. But I think most of us are going to leave now and see you guys over in the Wonder Room.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, guys.
See you there.
You guys have that,
Thanks.
and I'll stick around for a few minutes and keep moving people that way.